Food fraud is an ongoing problem around the world and affects many products and ingredients. In this video series, we're talking about food fraud and how it's being addressed in Canada. In our previous video, we talked about food fraud risks and how they can be detected. Now, what examples of food fraud have we seen in Canada?
So, for example, through concerns that were raised by stakeholders as well as CFIA's internal research, adulteration of honey was identified as a concern a few years ago. And between 2018 and 2020, CFIA conducted targeted sampling and testing of honey to detect adulteration with foreign sugars. And as a result of these actions, over 95,000 kilograms of adulterated honey was prevented from being sold in the Canadian market. Another example is fish species misrepresentation. This was identified as an issue and was addressed by the CFIA in 2019-20. We conducted targeted sampling and tested high-risk species for fish misrepresentation, and that was using DNA testing of fish that revealed that 92% of fish samples taken were actually satisfactorily labeled with the proper common name. And perhaps a longer ongoing area, as an example, is our olive oil testing program. So we test olive oil and other vegetable oils to verify authenticity and compliance with compositional and labeling regulatory requirements. And we use analytical methods that are capable of detecting adulteration at quite low levels. And information about contravention of regulations is posted on the agency website under compliance and enforcement or prosecution sections.
In January 2020, so at the start of COVID, I wrote an article for The Conversation. And in that article, I argued that food fraud in Canada is hidden in plain sight. And what I mean by that is that a lot goes undetected, as we talked about earlier. But I do want to point out that Kathy mentioned, 92% of fish in CFIA's testing is accurate. So that's 8% is not. But there are independent testing, from Oceania and others that have identified about 40%. And I think what I would like to see is that CFIA weigh in on the Oceania report, because there's a huge gap of over 40%. And that was done with Guelph University, who's our top experts on fish fraud. And then globally, Professor Alan Riley, who's the former CEO of the Food Inspection Agency of Ireland. And it was actually Alan that detected the horse meat scandal in Europe. So he was asked by UN FAO to look at global fish fraud. And he identified an average of about 20%, and in some cases it could be as high as 100%. I think red snapper was in that area. But as Kathy pointed out earlier, there's more and more fraud, and including fish fraud, that's now a human health and safety issue, and that's the big risk that we have here. A 2019 study that was done by Dalhousie on Canadian businesses, and 56% of the respondents said they were confident that they could deal with food fraud vulnerabilities, but only 33% of them said that their business was safe from food fraud. So I think that is a concern, and that triggered me of another study that I looked at late 2017 in the UK, which was with 200 food and beverage companies, and almost the same percentage, in fact 32% of those companies said that they cannot verify the authenticity of the ingredients that they source. So when you think about this, I often describe this as the cascading consequences of system failures. So if those incoming inspections are not being done, and those ingredients are put into tens or hundreds of products, then the cascading consequences are quite significant for human health and safety.
When we talk about the consequences for human health and safety, can we expand on the impact food fraud has on consumers and producers?
So consumers are expecting their labels to be truthful and not misleading. And when a food product is misrepresented, it prevents consumers from making an informed choice. So this can, of course, pose serious health risks if, for example, an unidentified allergen or hazardous materials were added to the food. But it can also have and will have an economic impact on the buyer, for example, paying more for a product that's actually of lower quality. In addition to this, it could erode consumer trust in the supply chain and marketplace or areas within it. In terms of producers, the vast majority of the Canadian industry is taking their responsibility to comply with regulatory requirements very seriously. And while it might be a small group of players that are carrying out deceptive practices, we're aware that food fraud or food misrepresentation could affect the reputation of the industry as a whole in the global trading marketplace. So not only is this an economic drain to the business owners and industry, it also creates an uneven playing field for businesses who are complying. For example, in the case of adulterated honey, domestic honey producers have reported that these less expensive products cut into their business and create that unfair playing field.
But I think, fraud impacts the trust between the trading partners and also with consumers. And of course, the worst case scenarios are when food fraud leads to food safety concerns. So we had the Peanut Corporation of America in 2009, where 9 people died, 700 were sick, and it was 300 products impacted, or 300 food companies, 360, I should say, and 3,900 products. So that was a deliberate act where the CEO, his brother, and the quality executive knew that the products were unsafe and still shipped them. So when you have those deliberate acts, it's very difficult to mitigate. No governance system will be able to fix that. And then we had just the year before that, the melamine crisis in China. Now, at that time, the dairy industry was very immature in China. It was less than 10 years old, but you had the 4 top companies that were actually colluding. And allegedly, it was the scientists that came up with the notion that you can put melamine in diluted milk to be able to defeat the analytical testing for nitrogen. But in that case, 6 children died, 300,000 got sick. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the cascading consequences, the fallout of that were dairy products that were impacted across 47 different countries. So it can be quite significant. And that drives us towards this notion, I'm sure Kathy focuses on this, I'm sure at Codex, is the critical need to collaborate across governments and share intelligence about what's going on.
The impact of food fraud is felt in the cost of products and the trust between producers and consumers. Find out more on consumer protection in our next video on the impact and response to food fraud in Canada.